Good morning, everyone. Oh, okay. Yashwantpur has Josh. Okay, good. Yeah. Your name begins with Josh, right? It rhymes with Josh. All right, good. First of all, let me begin with a profuse sense of thanks and gratitude to Father Biju, Head of Department, Nirmala Madam, Yashas, for giving the opportunity to be here, pulling me out of my regular bureaucratic job to spend time in world of ideas and with people who are accomplished and try to bring new meaning to the world. I'm also thankful to Nauseen Verishi and Parth. I thought the way they took care, I thought they were dean, HOD, director rolled into one. Right, they took all decisions, took fantastic care. I felt, all of you can now resign. There are people who take care of this campus. But thank you so much. I deeply appreciate. To my fellow panelists, it's certainly a deep honor and privilege to be sharing these days with you. And the kind of accomplishment that you have done is certainly humbling to me. I was supposed to begin at 11, and it's 11:20, but I'll say 10, 11:20. I'll try to close by 12, because that's the time that's given. I'm not good at keeping time, but I will try my best, right? Okay. I'm a teacher, it's not the teacher who will go out of the class when the bell rings. Somebody has to stand there, peep in, knock, and finally they say they're going to die. So I say, okay, now I'm done. I'm going out of the class. I'm that kind of a teacher. So, but I'll try to be more disciplined in Yashwantpur campus than I am otherwise. Okay. The key terms today are maybe three: performance, archives, and culture. I probably will go back and forth. I'll be very brief because I've been told not to talk, but to only ask questions. So, but I will still, give in to my cravings and say something before I begin. Now, the first word is archive, and this panel, at least the organizers are trying to, in some sense, pitch performance versus archive. Archive is a Greek word, archeon, which meant technically a house of the official where the documents are kept, or official documents are kept. From there it goes to Rome, goes to Romans, then goes to French, and if you didn't know, the French colonized the British, right? So then it goes to the British, right, in the 16th century, and then it comes to the 20th century around the world, and two important scholars that give some different perspectives for us are Foucault and Derrida. Most importantly, Derrida's very famous piece, The Archive Fever, 1995. So that's in brief. But so what does archive mean? So archive in one sense means where you keep the official documents, right? That's, yeah. Or in today's understanding, archive is also space where you design what the state considers, or the dominant considers as the acceptable knowledge of the society, right? So that's how the archive is today understood in a very, very modern terms. I won't be this technical as I go ahead, I promise you. This is just a beginning for those who want to contextualize these discussions. The second word is, so the understanding is that archive is the dusty place, or sometimes these days well-lit, very specially lit place. If when you started the promo, you notice there's only one light on that podium, right? That kind of arrangement, is what modern archive is. Therefore, it is also seen as something old, preserved, not living. That's the idea for archive that we have. Although that is not the original even understanding of archive. The vis-a-vis what we have is a performance, right? So performance in general, at least in this context of this panel, is considered as a high performance, right? Because performance as such is part of our everyday life, right? What I'm doing now is not panel discussion, I'm performing, right? In certain ways, right? But, we refer to these arts or artifacts, the cultural artifacts in the form of painting, dance, music, theater, right, as performances. That's the second word. I will stay with the classical understanding of performance. And the third is culture. And culture is, again, I come from my primary training is in culture studies. So in culture studies, again, everything that we do as human beings is culture, in the sense that the way we have sat, the way the stages are arranged, the way it is lit, the way you are sitting quietly, I'm not sitting quietly, I'm talking, you're quiet. In that, what do we produce as a relationship and what we make possible because of this arrangement, right? Would be also culture, right? Everything else, the way you dress, why am I worn, all this would be part of culture. But keeping aside, in the context of this panel, culture is broadly understood as performative arts, what we, second word, performance, as a culture. Now, the panel is going to discuss about these performances as these performances encounter or embrace, I don't know they can really encounter, but embrace the digital culture, or digital society, which is predominantly mediated through digital devices and digital consumptions, right? Which is your mobile phones, YouTubes, internet, billboards, or even billboards or posters designed by the AI and other things. So that's the mediation through which this happens. We are able to get Dr. Leema Das all the way from Assam, largely because that's accessible to us through the many digital forms, and that's how we know her. You know Abhijit Das, of course, Nalini and Smriti are from Bangalore, so of course they're not too far. But we generally access them through the digital forms. We even know them through the digital forms, and not necessarily just because we happen to see their performances. So this is the, how the digital technology mediates these performances. The question then is, and this is a question that I'll begin with asking questions, because I've been told you should ask questions and not talk. So I'll begin with asking Dr. Leema Das. Leema Das, of course, is, as introduced, is Satriya performer. She also performs in cinema, which are seen as a diametrically two different kinds of worlds altogether. But she's also a teacher. 15 years she taught dentistry. She's also a clinician. I mean, that is a very rare combination. You probably meet only one in your lifetime, so please enjoy and appreciate her when she's here. And maybe an indication to all of you that many times we think of inhabiting the world of the culture, world of the art as one profession, but he is someone who cuts across so many diverse, and something that's something that I wish you take from her. The question I have is that, so when you perform, right, we're looking at archive as a living archive. So again, sorry, back to the theory a little bit. You have heard of mantras, right? Mantras you have heard? Mantra. You've heard of proverbs, right? So once bitten, twice shy, or, right? These are proverbs. So, on sayings, phrases, these are also, for me, archives, right? They are archives of the oral culture, right? They codify knowledge in certain forms. And we also codify them in the form of dances, right? We codify religious knowledge, state knowledge, whatever knowledge in various performances. So the performances also are, in some sense, living archives. So today we are looking at that archive. So when you perform Satriya, or mostly that, and also the music, how much of the archive or the old that lives and forms in your performances, and how much is it transformed, and what transforms it?
Thank you for the question. When I was 8 years old, I learned Odissi. And my teacher would say that we are not going to improvise. Guru Gangadhar Pradhan had come from Orissa, and he said, this is for you to preserve. I did that till my 10th standard, and then I got bored, because I needed to, come out of that to explore what I could give to the art form. And that is when Hotriya happened to me, Satriya. My Satriya guru said, do whatever you want. I will stop you when you cross the line. And that is what kept me in Hotriya. Because it gave me space to breathe. And I believe that breathing space is very important for any artist, to be able to explore what you can give in return to the art form. So today when I dance Hotriya, at the back of my mind, I have those Vaishnav monks looking at me with big eyes, so that I don't cross the line. But at the same time, I also remember my guru. I know that he will tell me. He's still there. He is 94, and he still takes on the stage to perform. So much of me is what tradition has taught me. But today, I know I have that much of knowledge that I can improvise, I can reinterpret, so that somebody who doesn't know about Hotriya I can still hold your attention while I'm performing. That I'm very careful about. So I think that is the answer to the question, and to be precise.
Sure. One of the things that both archive and performance have in common is that they are both, in some sense, an attempt of the human civilization to pass on something that is old to the next generation. So one of the things that she was saying is that I have to do this both. I have to hold this, and I also ensure that I pass it on and hook the new audience that I need to have. I will move to Asijit Datta. You're doing something very fascinating, which is that I don't know whether the university expects you to publish so many papers every year. It does, okay. In my university also does, right? I'm exempted, but all the others are not, okay. So now and that knowledge is always behind paywalls. It's highly controlled and only for a small peer community. And you try to take that to a much broader world, more democratic, audience. So when you do this, right, you're also building a digital archive. Is this a thought in your mind when you do that? And in that sense, how do you transform all these questions about preservation, continuity, keeping old knowledge versus questioning and moving, and how the digital that you are creating is transforming your own practice and the practice of others?
Yeah. And thank you so much for the question. I think you're also referring to my YouTube channel, where I just bring all kinds of scholars from all over the world.
I just told him I subscribed his channel today because I didn't know about it. I encourage everybody to subscribe as well.
Yeah. So the entire point behind opening up this channel is to simplify very dense theoretical perspectives. And I think that's sprung from my own difficulty to understand. Very interestingly, I was trying to read during my master's days, Can the Subaltern Speak? By Spivak. And it took me around 4 hours to decode a 3-page essay. And then I thought it's written for the subaltern, apparently. And me being an urban, educated, quote-unquote, male, heteronormative, and I have the difficulty to decode this kind of text. So what can I do for my students beyond the classroom? Though I do think the classroom is an extremely political space. Because, again, that is where, I think classroom is also a living archive, where you are performing for the student, because you are a mediator between the text and the receiver. So I think it's also a living archive, classroom, but also for my YouTube channel, building an archive would mean breaking down things, building a repertoire where people can go back to if they're slipping out. Because the point with academia is, the worst thing about academia is its insularity. We are all in echo chambers. We're all congratulating each other. I am quoting you, you are quoting me. Wow, amazing, this comradeship between us. But what about, we are not doing it for each other primarily. We're doing it for the broader population.
True.
And that's the purpose behind this.
True. Yeah. So you've been, this is to Nalini. You've been documenting since 2006 and your own training. So how much of the document is, in some sense, a preservation of what is there, and how much is transforming it for the digital? And do you see tensions? Do you have concerns? And how do you navigate them?
Thank you for the question. I'm going to refer back first to what Asijit said, that when I started this blog, it was also a way for me to understand several concepts related to art, because I did my master's in chemistry. I specialized in organic chemistry, and it just happened. So I worked in pharma, and this became my second career, actually, and started freelancing for, several newspapers, especially the Times of India. And actually, it was the editor who encouraged me to write on art, knowing that I had studied art when I was in the US. So he thought if one can paint, one can write. That's not how it is. But fortunately for me, I could write, but I hadn't tried writing on art. So anyways, I was doing a lot of writing for the print media. And I realized at some point that my audience was limited. It was only the people who were getting the newspapers and the magazines that they would be reading about it. Having a tech person at home really helped, and I started this blog in 2006. So this is the 20th year of having this blog on Indian art.
I think you should give a big round of applause.
Yes, please do.
Because
Thank you so
it is
much.
not easy to sustain 20 years of digital life. Okay.
It has
I didn't
had,
succeed. I also started in 2006. I didn't succeed. Yeah.
So it has had its ups and downs, but I am proud to say that when I started it, it was probably the only blog on Indian art which was run by an individual. So it was not a consortium or a corporate that was doing this blog. It was just me. And initially the idea was to just increase access and reach out to more people. And it really did do that, because when I started, I mean, print, of course, the circulation was in Bangalore, but the blog helped me connect with people across geographies. And that was one of the things which, really encouraged and motivated me. So, like I said, initially it was about documenting, because I was also figuring out things. It was, explaining concepts. Also remember that now access to art has changed a lot, thanks to the digital medium, and there is so much awareness and people understand art that much better. Those days, the white cube itself was such a, prohibitory space in many ways. There were people who were intimidated. They did not, they hesitated to step into an art gallery. They did not know how to approach artists, how could they reach them, whether they could, visit their studios. All of that was prevalent that time. So this was also to democratize, art and reach out and make it more accessible. So that is how it started. Over a period of time, it also became a little more educational, if I can say that, because then it was about, how can artists reach out to galleries? How can they, how can collectors start collecting? Because those days, again, that was something which was not very common. And how to make more collectors, have people buying more art. So slowly the tone of the blog started changing, but it was also very organic in that sense. It was not very conscious at the time. And over 20 years, it has so much data. It has become a resource site, in fact. And
archive itself.
Yeah, it is an archive, and people can refer to it and find out information, things which happened 20 years ago. And it wasn't just limited to Bangalore, it was all over India, and then there were a lot of people writing in from, abroad as well, and I could incorporate that too. I've also had several guest writers who have sent in pieces and written about, authenticity and provenance and all kinds of things. So it has grown. And during COVID, I think that was the time when the major shift happened. And I curated an exhibition which was completely on the blog. So these were contemporary artists from Mumbai, Delhi, and Bangalore. And the show previewed on a digital medium.
Yeah, I'll ask one question there, if I may.
Please do.
Yeah. So what is lost in that? So you are converting a physical artifact into a digital format. What is
Right.
lost in the process? Or is there any loss, or there is no loss?
There is definitely a loss. I think anytime you convert physical to, offline or digital, the contact, the physical contact, and that is something which people still tell me, that when they look at a picture online, they see it virtually, it's just not the same. Especially when it comes to, I think, creating more immersive experiences, sometimes it's important to have that connect right there in front of you. Because ultimately, we are still social beings, and we would like to have that physical connect with artists also.
Sure.
Yeah.
One question back to Dr. Lima. So your performances, you perform live, right? And they also are access people like us. We can't go to Assam, so we can, but I'm saying we're stuck in the Bangalore traffic, so can't reach there. So when people like us see your performance, or you see in your performance on the digital format, what is your feeling? What do you feel about it? I mean, she talked about this, the sense of loss that she notices, physical presence.
I dislike it completely. I feel there's a huge gap. There's a big loss. Because, like I said in my talk today, when you're talking about a community-rooted art form like Hotria, it is ingrained in everyday life. It is related to worship. It is related to so many other things. So watching it on screen, it's not even half of the experience. You have to see it to live it. For example, it's like watching a play on screen. You don't watch plays on screen. You go for the entire experience. Even when you're using music that was created in a studio, is very different from playing live music when you're performing.
What's the difference?
It's a huge difference.
As a performer, for you, yeah.
It is a huge difference. Because the imperfection is the difference. You don't know where your cellist is going to go wrong, where your percussionist or the flutist is going to go wrong. And that is the moment when you improvise. That is where the magic begins. In all those cracks, in all those falls. You don't have that in a digital experience. You don't have that, you know that the track is going to play perfectly the way you have rehearsed. So, classical dance especially, if you're going to archive classical dance, you have to shoot it in that way, like a film. It cannot be that I'm performing here and somebody is shooting it. That's why I don't have too many videos of my Hotria dance, because it's not the same. Because it lowers the gravitas of the performance.
You consciously don't permit that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it lowers the gravitas. The essence is not there. But yes, what we gain is reach, and people can look at the video and trying to find out more about the dance form. That is why digital platforms are required. It can't be compared, of course, but you can't say that this is superior. But the differences is in the experience, of course.
Thank you.
Could I just add one quick
yeah.
line? Because you mentioned experience, and that is so important. I think many of us who've either taught or done webinars, especially during COVID, it was isolating. Believe me, sitting in my room and talking to a screen and trying to make them understand what I'm trying to say. It was just it's not the same. So the experience really does matter.
Sure. Dr. Smriti, you reimagine lost, forgotten mythologies and somehow make them accessible in a contemporary visual language. So when you do that, are you curating it as an archivist, or are you writing it for the future?
Am I writing it for?
Future.
I think both.
Okay.
I think both, but yeah, I'm curating it definitely because I go after the stories that have been neglected for very concrete reasons. Either because they did not want women to be seen in a certain way, or they didn't want certain kinds of gods to be celebrated. Like, for instance, there is this moment in time where people stopped looking at the forest for their gods and started to look skyward. That meant that movement of looking away from the forest has cut us from the environment around us, right? So that's a very crucial thing that happened across our species, that when we chose to look in a different direction, to look for divinity. So then what happened to those forest gods? What happened to those stories that are left in places that now are deemed irrelevant? And we are suffering the consequences of that choice because now we are suffering the consequences of a very bad environmental condition we are left in. So, so these mythologies to me show those huge things that eventually kind of escalate and become magnum opus. But I go after the small stories, the small ones that show that moment of turn, or that moment of, like stories that show female goddesses in such a way that allowed them to function in a way that was not culturally acceptable. But the gods did it. So they had to remove those stories or not tell those stories because that became problematic, right? Or gender fluidity that existed in gods, but it couldn't accept those things. So, so I go after these stories that allow for me to show how culture, what we think of as culture or tradition, is shown as static. Something that's a monolith that's carved on stone. It's not. It has always changed. It has always been changing. right? What we see today, and we said, oh, but that's culture. That culture has changed. It changed from something else. So it can change again. And it can be something that we want it to be also. So for me, I think that narrative becomes important because we can then play with culture, live with culture, and as you were talking about with your story with dance, it is, be able to make it alive again,
Out of curiosity, I'm slightly sidestepping from the theme of the discussion. You said that human civilization began to look away from the gods in the forest to gods in the sky. But why did we do that? And what?
There is no actual reason given for that, but I think it was the merging of cultures. There were cultures that were more forest-bound, and then there came other cultures that came from different landscapes that did not have forests, for instance, and they did look at climate and sky and everything for their sense of being. So when those cultures came and mixed with these forest cultures, certain gods won. Certain cultures won, right? And those became prominent, and those stayed. So I would give it. I think, for instance, there is this one goddess called Ushas, who is a morning goddess, goddess of dawn, and there is. Tropical countries, we normally there's this kind of sun gods are male gods, So this idea of a delicate morning goddess couldn't have come up here, and they kind of traced her back to northern Central Asia for where she came from. So it's interesting to see where these gods came from, why did they look the way they were, why were they worshipped, why was dawn so important? In the tropics, there's no issue with dawn. We get day. It's not a problem. But when you come from darker landscapes where the dawn is a special thing, it doesn't come all the time, then you worship the dawn when it comes, right? So when a dawn goddess comes from there to a tropical landscape, she stays, but she becomes something else here, right? So I don't know how, but I would say that moving of people and the winning of certain cultures set the precedence for certain things to survive.
One of the things I think perhaps is also the rise of cities. Because cities, when they come together, you don't have space, the space becomes a constraint. And you, of course, you remove the forest and start building. Then the only way is to look up. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Just to add to Smriti's point, this is a beautiful book by Robert Graves. It's called The White Goddess, where he talks about how we, from this downward-looking culture, where you have the mitti, you have the ground so close to you. Suddenly you move, because of Christianization, you move to Heavenly Father, who is up there judging you. You don't do this, don't do that. So he talks about Gaia and the White Goddess, and from this to that. So that's a beautiful book.
But Christianity picked from Judaism.
Yes, yeah,
There's
absolutely.
also one more thing which I want to add to stories. Some stories are not told for whatever reason. Even when we are talking about stories from epics, there are characters we brush under the carpet. Taking the narrative only from the protagonist, the one we want to worship as hero. One such character is Shurpanakha. So when I wanted to do Shurpanakha, I told my guru, I want to tell her side of the story. She fell in love with Rama. What's wrong with that? You don't need to chop off her nose and ears for that. She is a young girl.
Yeah, you want to
Tell
clap?
me
Clap.
what is
No
wrong.
problem. Okay.
Come on. We are living in this century where female gaze is a thing. Right? So yeah, I told the story from Shurpanakha's perspective in Hotria. So that's possible. Just change the narrative.
Sure. So one of the things that came across from the panelists is also the sort of a tension towards moving into the new formats, and the the experience not being the same when you consume something through the digital medium vis-a-vis a physical medium that we're used to. But one thing too, of course, Ms. Smriti did mention about it, that it's something like a flowing water. There's technically nothing that is constant about any of these. And of course, Dr. Lima also said how she wanted to make a shift, right, in terms of who is now the protagonist and, whose gaze and whose views, I need to bring to the fore vis-a-vis maybe the old archives I've created. So my new archive will be of a different kind of a configuration. But one thing to remember is that even the contemporary forms that we speak so highly about were not always there. For example, now when we say theater or even the performances, right, that Odissi and the Satriya, they are done largely in auditoriums like this, right? But this has a history of just about 150 years. Prior to that, they were not performed in these closed spaces, right? So there's a huge contribution from modern cinema to bring them into this kind of a format. There's a fear about the fires that destroyed, right? That have a lot to contribute towards this. The colonial governments wanting to control people in certain ways have contributed. Otherwise, all the performances she does today, they were all done in temples and not anywhere outside temples. They were closely bound to the temples. The paintings that we, both of you are involved in that, especially you, that we talk so much about, they were not meant to be in a gallery, right? Until the 16th century, they were, at least in the Western context, they were only in the church. And the purpose was not art appreciation. I mean, that was for the artists, right? But the audience that they were catering to were not the aesthetic, elite audience, but it is the people who can't read. And how do you teach them faith? Right? How do you, it's interesting that, in Satriya, which begins as a strong Shaivite practice, starts embracing Vaishnavite practices, stories, into that. Yeah, go on.
Satriya is not, it was born as a Vaishnav practice.
Oh, Vaishnav, okay, then my reading is wrong. Sorry.
Yes,
okay.
it was born as a Vaishnav practice, and it was for propagation of bhakti during the bhakti movement, 15th century, where the society was fragmented. Caste hierarchy was there. So only the Brahmins knew how to read and write. So all the mantras, all the rituals were in Sanskrit. Common man had no access even to the places. So during this time, Mahapurusha Shankardev, Srimanta Shankardev, he came as a transformative figure. What he did was he prepared devotional dramas, which included Sanskrit slokas. It also included a language called Brajavali, which is a mix of Assamese, Hindi, Maithili, so that the common man could understand. And everybody was invited, not just to view it, not just to see it, but also to perform in it. So basically, art has this power of bringing people together. And it is actually the other way around. What started as a Vaishnav practice, when I bring it to today's stage, I want to do more with it. But because it is Vaishnav in nature, rooted in culture, I will not do a Hotriya performance, a Shiv Bhakti with a Hotriya performance, but I will bring in Draupadi. It is from the Mahabharata. I will bring in her side of the story. I will bring in Shikhandi's side of the story, the LGBTQ community. I will bring in stories as a human, but rooted in culture. I believe as a performer, that is my responsibility.
Sure. Thanks for the correction. Yeah. So the point that continues is that many of these performances had a purpose of spiritual, spiritual is a very difficult word, spiritual, cultural need to take them or educate or take religion or faith to the common masses, right? It could be the paintings of Sistine Chapel in Rome, which is primarily meant for people who can't read. How do you continue the faith in them? Or the Satriya performances that she talked about. How do you teach religion, God, to masses as against those who have limited access to it? And this is true of all kinds of music. Many times, because we brought the Western framework of secular versus, religious, which is problematic in Indian context. Many times we somehow want to push religion out and say, no, we'll do the secular aspect of it, without realizing that all the performative forms that you have today, including cinema, have their roots in the religious purposes. And if that was not there, none of them would have survived. None of them would have grown. None of them have built, right? And they continue to sustain. Of course, the modern state's Bible is not the Bible. Its constitution is the Bible of the modern state. And its performances, the Republic Day, are the new rituals of this new modern state. And it will do. But one of the things that comes out interestingly from Dr. Lima, is that even in the modified form of today, and even in converting it to digital, the originary intentions and the traditions don't allow you to go beyond a certain boundaries, right? Even when you said that, you said that many of the older gods of the forest, they find their way into the modern religions, and including the artifacts, and somehow dominate their presence and continuity into them. You want to give some examples of that?
I mean, they don't dominate, that's the sad part. But yes, they find their way because we are curious. There is curious species. We like to look at what was hidden. So I think all of us as artists will tend to do that. But they don't survive. They are kind of, I mean, for instance, Yaksha and Yakshi, these are forest beings that hold wealth.
I was thinking of Ganapati, in fact, when I was saying that.
Okay,
so how he has survived from the Ganas to the,
Yes,
main.
that's true. Yeah, and coming into the mainstream in a huge way.
Yeah,
Like he
right.
definitely struck gold. Yeah, but with the Yaksha and Yakshi, for instance, these are forest, almost little demons, but who hold wealth, and that's seen as problematic because we human beings want the wealth. So, but they have been carved, and their huge monuments are in front of the Reserve Bank of India and has been there for many, 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 many years. But we don't know those are Yaksha and Yakshis because they are these forest beings that guard wealth, right? So it's, and for instance, there are certain gods that are there, but we have no idea why they're there. And I remember there's this one version of Shiva in the north, and I saw a temple there, but it's Shiva in the female form. And I didn't question it because there is that idea that there are gods in female forms, and people are like, yeah, that's Shiva as the female form, that's it. But the story behind why Shiva is a female is actually such a beautiful one. He just wanted to go into Krishna's a garden and dance with the gopikas, but men weren't allowed there. So he goes into the Yamuna and comes out as a woman, and then he goes inside so that he can spend time with Krishna and dance with the other gopikas and just enjoy himself. And that is such a beautifully pointless story. Like there's no victory, there is no wealth, there is no nothing to be gained. It's just music and dance, and really the reason why we should be existing. Like that's that story, right? So for me, I feel like that's where it's at. Where we find our gods doing things that they really want to do and not just being heroes, and exhausting us. But so I feel like there are these beautiful hidden things that are worth finding, and they're treasures, and they're there. These temples exist. The Gopeshwar temple exists. People go there and worship to this god. And
Where is it? Which part of the North India it is?
in UP somewhere, there are a couple. There are a couple.
Okay.
Yeah, towards the Himalayas.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks. I give the example of one, of course, the forest god. I mean, the pre-monotheistic gods, if I can say that way, living in the monotheistic religions and our modern, very secular kind of, very commercial kind of practices. I'll give you the other example is the Superman. All of you seen Superman? Yeah, but it's interestingly, if you see his dress that he wears, is exactly the same color combination and the acts he does. He comes sweeping from somewhere. And remember, he's also a godly element, right? This is in Christianity, Archangel Michael. If you see the entire paintings, you have the Archangel Michael in red and blue in the paintings of the Sistine Chapel and elsewhere, and you have a modern, and he does the same function. So the function hasn't changed. It's that you've secularized, him into Superman. I can go on into multiple things, into not just these things, but into some of the political philosophies of human rights, how they all have their, elsewhere. So in some sense, archivist's job, which of course they did talk about, on one hand, is also to try and pull out some of these interesting things or give them a new perspective, or pull out and show that these exist. I am very close to my time.